So Nexmo sponsoring again this year for the second year in a row. Basically, it's a way to interact through their API with different sorts of communication. So, phone calls, SMS, all those kind of things that many apps need at this point. So if you're looking to do anything with that to kind of extend out into the physical world, physical communication tools, connect with phones and all that stuff. And there's many other APIs beyond that, but I know kind of the baseline is going to be phone and SMS for a lot of people. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out Nexmo. They're in the digital swag bag is a 10 euro credit. So that's going to get you up with a whole bunch of API calls just right off the bat to be able to try it out, build a test app, swap it into your app, and give it a go. So much thanks to Nexmo. A really great tool. Thanks for sponsoring 2 years in a row. And everybody, please make sure to check them out on the digital swag page and give it a shot. It's going to be free for you, 10 euro credit. So, really quick to get started with. I've played with it a bit myself already, and give it a go. Really clean stuff. Okay. Let's see here. Bring in Jonathan. Alrighty. He's coming on board. There he is.
Howdy.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Excellent.
Okay, so you're going to talk to us about some very interesting stuff. So let's jump right into it. Take it away.
All right, awesome. I guess I got to share my screen here, so I'll start by doing that. All right. Cool. Can we see? Yeah? No?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Ian. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be part of Laracon Online this year. I hope you guys are all enjoying the conference. It's been pretty awesome so far. I've been really stoked with the talks and the speakers. It's been really good. I'll try not to disappoint. Okay, let's dig right in. My talk is going to be about advanced querying with Eloquent. So I've been writing PHP for about 20 years, and I've been working with Laravel since, the Laravel 3-4 days. And about 3 years ago,
Jonathan, one second. We're getting reports that you might be on the wrong mic if you want to check that.
Okay.
You can select it right next to the little mute button. Is an up arrow you can click and make sure the right mic is in there.
There's an up arrow?
Next to the mute icon.
It says stop video. Oh, this is... Leave. Okay, I'm not seeing that.
If you escape, try escaping out if you're in like a full screen.
Yeah, this is annoying. Okay, let me just stop.
Yeah, try that.
Okay, let me. So, there's the up arrow. Yep. Yep, you're absolutely right. I am.
And is that better?
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, that's better?
Yeah, I'd say it's better, yes.
How convincing. Okay, so.
That's good. There you go.
Okay, I just moved a little bit closer. Okay.
Rocking and rolling now.
All right, let's just start over here. Yep. All right. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. So been doing PHP for about 20 years. Been working with Laravel since version 3. And about 3 years ago, I stopped working for the company that I had been at. It was a creative firm that I'd been at for about a decade, and I started working for this company down in Huntsville, Alabama, of all places. As a Canadian, I don't know, I was just drawn to the heat or something. So I don't know, although I work remote, so I don't really get to experience the heat. But anyway, so I've been working for this company for about 3 years. The name of this company is Spur, and they were doing some really neat things in the education and the staffing space. And they basically, when I started working with them, they wanted to basically create a piece of software of their own that they could use. So pretty normal situation where a business wants to create some software to help them, kind of do their business. So this project was interesting for me. One, because it was my first product company that I worked for. But more than that too, it kind of introduced me to some technical challenges that I hadn't really previously run into on the projects that I had worked on, especially being at a creative firm. It was much more marketing style projects that didn't have, say, a ton of users. It was more like simpler projects. So this project had a lot of data, more data than I really expected at first. And when I say a lot of data, I don't mean like the way Google and Yahoo mean big data where they have like warehouses of servers and stuff. I just mean big data compared to what I was used to. So right now, I think our main database is somewhere at around 25 gigs. And for me, that is just like just a ginormous database. And it certainly has some impacts on how you got to write your code and work with it. And we felt some pain early on with it. There's no question about that. We started running into situations where our page loads went from a few seconds or a second or less, and we started having page loads 15, 20, 30 seconds. They'd time out before they ever finished. And obviously that was a major issue. And I think immediately, sort of like right away, we didn't really think that the problem was our code base. We kind of looked more at our infrastructure. So we were using Heroku at that time, which is really an amazing tool that allows you to easily scale up. And so what we did is we added more horsepower to our Postgres database, and we added more workers, and we added more web servers, and we had the whole system going with the load balancer and everything else. And it was all like that side of it was really solid, and yet our app was still quite slow, which got us to basically reflect in a little bit like what were we doing wrong. And it turns out that if you have 10,024 database queries loading on a single page load, that you're going to probably run into some problems. And we were definitely doing this. We were running into serious N+1 database query issues. We were loading way too much data. And this was all sort of amounting to a poorly performing app. So we made a decision as a team at one point that we were going to basically strive to have every single page load in 500 milliseconds or less. That was going to become a metric that we wanted to use. And truth be told, at that time, if we could get it down to 2 or 3 seconds, we would have been happy. But set your goal high, or in this case, low, if you know what I mean. Okay, so we made that decision, and this is sort of the formula that led to that being successfully executed. We had to minimize our database queries, and we had to minimize our memory usage, and that would give us our fast page loads. And again, we aim for the 500 milliseconds or less. Now, looking at this here, it's sort of like, yeah, duh, obviously. It seems very obvious, and it is very obvious, but I guess it wasn't for us at first, and we had to learn the hard way on this. So it wasn't even just these things on their own. There was a bigger lesson that we had to learn, and that bigger lesson was really just to do more work in the database layer. We were doing way too much work in PHP on the Laravel side, and we were doing way too many requests, and we weren't really taking advantage of what the database as a tool was really good at. We're sort of wasting that resource, and I mean wasting, because we were spending a lot of money with Heroku on a really good database, and it was still not running that great. So what I want to do for the next 30, 40 minutes here is I want to walk you through sort of a bunch of techniques that we used to make our application much more performant. And I'm going to do that by basically walking through a demo app that I created, which is called Lara CRM, which is just a really simple customer management sort of app. It's just a one-page app here, but I think it's a good example app and a good example page of what you might find in a typical app where you have a bunch of customer data or user data or some type of data that you want to list out in a table sort of form with pagination and some searching and some filtering and all that sort of stuff, and the type of problems that you can run into on a simple page like this. So it's actually, there's a number of interesting problems that we'll run into. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through 8 different requirements, and each requirement adds something to the page, upgrades the page, and we'll have some problems with it that we'll have to fix. Now, I'm not going to actually live code it because I'm not crazy, but I'm going to do somewhere of a halfway in between where I'm going to essentially copy and paste the code, and then I'll paste it in, and then we'll go back and we'll look through and kind of I'll explain what I'm doing. It's a bunch of code. There's quite a bit of code actually, so you'll want to have all eyes on deck here, and basically, hopefully it'll go pretty quick here because you don't have to watch me actually typing things out. So let's hope that I don't end up with a disaster here where I can't figure out why something's broken, but then I'll just have to call in a friend or something. Okay. Before we jump into the code, I want to show you, I should mention one thing here. You can find, I have all the code for this whole talk up at github.com/Reinink/Laracon 2018. So if you go there, all the code's here. And what I've done is I've actually split it up into every single one of the steps I'm going to go through during this talk. And so you can follow along with that, just literally commit by commit. I'm not going to cover the setup at the bottom here because the setup just includes some boring stuff that's really not that interesting. It doesn't really pertain to this talk. But if you want to look, kind of see how I did that, it's like seed data stuff and migrations. If you want to look in there, by all means, go ahead and do that. But I'm not going to cover that here. Okay, so maybe what I'll do next is I will jump over and we'll look at the data itself. So this is the database. And you can see that I have a number of tables here. I have users and companies and customers and interactions and migrations and password resets. So in the user table, I have myself, Taylor Otwell, and Ian, you're in there as well. And I have customers. So there's 1,000 customers that I've seeded into this table. And each one of the customers has a company ID, a sales rep ID, a first name, a last name, and a birthday. All right. The companies is really simple. Every customer has a company, and it's a one-to-one relationship there. And the interactions, so this is the more interesting table that we're going to be doing a bunch of work with. So if you think of a CRM, you often in a CRM manage what a customer is doing, the activity that you have with them, the interactions that you have with them. So an interaction might be, you received an email from them, or a phone call, or a Twitter message, or some sort of other social activity, or maybe they viewed an invoice or paid an invoice, or you went out for dinner with them, or you had a meeting, or whatever. There's lots of different possible interactions. So what I've done is for every single customer, I've preloaded 500 interactions. So if you do the basic math there, 1,000 customers with 500 interactions, we have a database table here with 500,000 records. So I think this is kind of serves as a good base to sort of like, if we make some mistakes in the way that we load our data and do our querying, we'll see some performance issues happen with a database table of this size. So that's the data. All right, let's take a look at kind of the base setup here on the app side. Okay, so standard fresh Laravel install basically. And we have 3 main files that we're going to be working with. One is this customers controller, which has the index method, and that index method loads our customers page here. We have an actual customer object or model, and that has on it 2 relationships, one for the company, as I mentioned, which is a belongs to, and has many for the interactions. So we have an empty customer model and an empty interaction model, which we're not going to really deal with those but they just need to be there. And then the other important page that we're going to be working with is our actual blade view, which outputs the title, the number of customers found, the table that lists through the customer and outputs the customer, plus our pagination link. So if we look at this here, we have our title, customers found, all the users, all the customers, and then all the links. Okay, so pretty straightforward, right? So let's dig into the requirements and start working through these requirements one by one. So I have a file here that has all this listed in it. As I mentioned, I'm going to copy and paste as we go. So requirement number 1, we want to sort the customers by their name. And when we say their name, we mean their last name first and then their first name. So this is a pretty simple upgrade to this page. We can just go in here and we can say customer, order by last name, then first name, hit refresh, and lo and behold, A's first, and we jump to page 67, Z's last. Z is the correct way of saying that. As a Canadian, I think that's important to mention. Okay, so this is pretty good, but I don't really love that we're exposing like this specific database stuff right in our controller here, where we can see the actual columns from the table. I'd kind of rather wrap that up into some type of scope. So, and you'll see me using scopes a lot during this talk. So let's replace it with this. Let's say customer, order by their name, and then paginate those results. And then we're going to go over to the customer model, and we're going to actually create this scope. So not a big change, not entirely necessary, but I'm going to be using scopes a lot. So I sort of just wanted to give you a simple taste of how this works. So we now have a scope in our customer model called order by name, so that by using this scope prefix here, Laravel and Eloquent knows that, well, this is actually a way of adding additional parameters or additional pieces to our query builder that we're working with. So let's go back over here. And if we reload here, it should all work. Just to prove that that is using the scope. If I remove the scope, it'll blow up, which it does. Okay, requirement 1 done. Moving right along. So these are going to get progressively more difficult. So the second one is we want to add the company name. So this is pretty straightforward. We can go over to our Blade file. Let's drop in the company name. And all we're going to do is we know we have the relationship on customer ready to get the company. So we're just going to say customer company name. And if we reload this, sure enough, there we got our company, and we're basically done, right? Well, not exactly. You can see here that while our memory usage is still quite low, 3 megs, and our page speed is very fast, 60 milliseconds, we've now jumped up to 17 database queries here. So this gets to kind of what Chris was talking about in his earlier talk, where it's an N+1 issue. Every single row in this table is now making a separate database call to get that company so that we can display the name. So if you're at all familiar with Eloquent and you've worked with eager loading, this is a very simple problem to solve. So we just go to our controller and we say, okay, we're going to eager load the customers with the company name. And now if we reload this page, we're back down to 3 database queries. So this is great. We got the original database query to do the pagination. We got the database query to load the users and they're ordered. And then we also have the database query to eager load all the companies for the 15 users that are on this page. So queries are good, memory's good, page load speed, all good. So that was easy, simple, right? Well, what if we wanted to add the last interaction date? This is where things get a little bit more tricky. It seems a lot like adding the last interaction date, which an interaction is a relationship on the customer model. It seems like it would be a lot like the company, right? But there's one important difference, and that's that we have lots of interactions, but we only have one company, and that creates some interesting challenges. So let's walk through it. Let's say step 1 here. Let's try the easy, maybe the obvious company sort of approach to it, where we add in the last interaction and we say, okay, give me the interactions for this customer. Let's get the latest one, and we're going to do that by doing a sort by descending on created at. We're going to grab the first one. So keep in mind here that we're working with a collection here, right? Because we got all the interactions back. We're going to grab the first one. We're going to grab the created at column, and then we're going to do diff for humans. And diff for humans is just this handy carbon function that allows you to do this fancy way of outputting a date to a relative date. I'll show you what it looks like. Really handy little thing. So reload this, and here we go. Our last interaction column is working perfect. 6 days ago, 4 days ago, 2 weeks ago, it's working exactly as we expect it to work. However, we've got some alarm bells going off here. One, we're up to 18 database queries again. We have over 11 megs of memory being used, megabytes of memory being used, and we're almost at 400 milliseconds to load the page now. So that's a huge jump, which maybe doesn't seem that serious, but let's think about what's going wrong here. Well, one problem we know is we have the N+1 issue again, because for every single one of these people, we're loading that relationship. So it's like, okay, well, that's an easy problem to solve. Let's go in here. Let's add the interactions, eager load the interactions as well, reload the page, and okay, cool. We're down to 4 database queries. So we're good, right? Well, no, we're not. We still have over 13 megabytes of RAM being used, and we're still close to 400 milliseconds on the page load speed. And to me, this is where we really ran stuck at work. It's like we were running our database queries, and they were really fast. It's like 30 milliseconds, 1 millisecond, 3 milliseconds. Like it was all going fast, but the page was still loading slow. And the reason why is because we're using too much memory. And it's not the memory that's the problem per se. It's more the fact that there's just so much data that's being accessed here that it just is slowing things down. So let's think about this for a sec. We have 15 users, and each one of those users has 500 interactions. So if we just do a real basic calculation, we're going to do 15 users times 500. We have 7,500 interactions being loaded just to show this silly last interaction date. So that's a problem. And it's like loading that data is pretty quick, as we can see from our database query speed here. But the problem is Laravel now has to go off and has to convert all 7,500 of those records into actual Eloquent models for us to work with, even though we're not going to use all but 15 of them, right? So there has to be a better way. So one thing you might try to do here is you might just say, okay, I'm going to get rid of the intersections. I'm not going to interactions. I'm not going to eager load that data. And I'm going to take a different approach. So we're going to say, give me the customer interactions, but instead of loading all the interactions, we're going to say, give me the interactions query builder, which you can do off a relationship. So we're going to say, I'm going to write my own query here. And we're going to say, give me the interactions, grab the latest one, and get the first one. And latest is a handy query builder helper that basically just does an order by descending on the created at column by default. So it's just some nice little shortcut there. And get the first one. So what do we have here? We have this loading. This is running a database query and giving us one interaction record back. And then we call created at and diff for human on it. We reload. And now, okay, we look over these metrics over here. Our memory usage is way low. Our page load speed's great. But we're back up to 18 database queries, which you can imagine what's going on here. We've reintroduced this n+1 problem because we're now running a database query for every single record on this table, which is maybe the lesser of the two evils compared to the first solution that I showed you, but it's still a real problem. What happens if we ever wanted to add the ability to change the pagination from 15 records to 100? We now reload this page here. We're now at 103 database queries, and you can see that the page loads like pretty much up to 300 milliseconds again, and the memory's climbing. So this may seem like a solution, but it's actually not that great of a solution because we're running so many database queries. There has to be a better way. So this is actually a more tricky problem than you might realize. So one solution you might think at this point is to simply cache on the customer table either the last interaction date or even the last interaction ID on the actual customer table. That way you could create an actual relationship for the last interaction ID and then just load that exactly like we were loading the companies. And that would all be fast. Yes, it would be. And sometimes that is absolutely the right solution. The problem is that you've now created this caching problem in your database that you need to maintain. Anytime an interaction gets created, updated, or deleted, you need to make sure that your customer table has been updated properly to have that latest record. So, and depending on the situation, that might be a trade-off worth making. But I want to show you a different approach that you can take that maybe before you got to get to that point where you do the caching, you can use another technique. So let me show you this. Okay. The way to do this is using a subquery. So this is something that Laravel actually has and Eloquent has built-in support for, but I don't see shown that often. So let me just show you here for a sec how this could work. So I'm going to do some updating here. I'm going to update the actual, I'm going to create that scope, and I'm going to update our controller here. And I'm going to say, okay, give me the customers with the company with the last interaction date. And I'm creating this as an actual scope, and then order by name and paginate, okay? So in here, this scope, what it's going to do is it's going to add a select, it's going to basically add a sub-select, or it's going to add a select subquery, sorry. And we're going to give it a subquery, and we're going to say, well, whatever the result of that subquery comes back as, it's going to be called the last interaction date. That's what we're going to name the column. It's like aliasing a column. And the way we were going to write this subquery is because this select sub here, this method in the Eloquent query builder actually takes an instance of the query builder itself, which is nice. So we can say, okay, give us a created at date for the interactions for this customer, grab the latest one, and only grab one, because we only ever want one record back for a subquery. A subquery in the database can only have one result. So we're going to throw that on there. So now if we go ahead and run this, hit refresh here. If I haven't done anything wrong here, let I have obviously done something wrong because we still have 18 records okay, what am I doing wrong here? Where interactions, oh, right, I have to update my blade view. Okay, disaster averted. So what I need to do here is now that this is coming back and returning the last interaction date, I need to actually output the last interaction date here like it was just a normal column on the customer table. Okay, so reload this. Diff for humans, yes. So why is this not working? It's because I'm calling diff for humans on the last interaction date. Why would that not work? Well, it's because the last interaction date is not a carbon instance. It's just a string that we're returning from the database. So if we want to use it this way, we got to add a cast, which we can do. So let's go to the customer table, jump up to the top here, add last interaction date as a date time cast, reload, and we're back in business. And now look what we've done. We've now have 3 database queries. We're loaded in with about 3 megabytes of memory, and we're running at about 40 milliseconds. So this is really good. And if we actually look here, we can see what we're doing. We're selecting the customers. I'm going to actually copy this for a sec. I'm going to jump into Postico and to show you what these results would look like. So here, we can see here from this, we're selecting the customers, and then we're selecting as a subquery the created at from interactions for that customer, and we're ordering it by created at and taking one of those records, and then we're aliasing that as the last interaction date. So you can see here in this last column here, we now have the last interaction date. So it's like we're just grabbing another column from the database. Okay, so that's great. That's really like a really powerful little trick that you can use to allow you to get this related data from another table where you can't use standard Eloquent relationship eager loading, but you still, for example, in a situation where you have a has many relationship and you want just one of those records, this is a really, really good way of doing this. Okay. What do we need next? Our next requirement is, before I go to the next requirement, I actually have a way to improve this. So this particular scope is a little bit gnarly, right? It's got some weird looking code here. We have to use the actual query builder, and we can't use like an actual Eloquent query builder. So how could we clean this up? And because the Laravel Eloquent query builder is macroable, we can actually create a macro to make this code a little bit nicer. So I'm going to open the app service provider here, and I'm going to first update our scope. So this scope is just going to become a little bit prettier here. So instead of this, we're going to now say add subselect, which is my new macro. And we're going to say name that subselect as last interaction date, and then pass it an actual Eloquent query builder. So you can see I'm just saying exactly what we were writing before here, right, with the query builder, except I'm writing it with Eloquent. Give me the interaction, select the created at date for that user, and get the latest one. Okay, so this is what the actual macro looks like. It's only 7 lines of code. It's really quite simple. So let me just import the builder here. So what we're doing is we're running the subselect just like we were before, except what I'm doing is I'm automatically limiting that Eloquent query builder to one result, and then I'm calling create or get query, which is a method that's available in the Eloquent query builder that basically just gets the underlying query builder, which is required for the select sub. Don't worry too much about how this works. It's available in the repo. I just wanted to show you like how simple it is to actually simplify these scopes. So now if we go back and we reload this, it all works. It's the exact same implementation. It's just nicer looking. Okay, so let's move on. So requirement number 4, add the last interaction type. So this is obviously simple now because we know exactly how to do this, right? So we want to show the type right before the date, right? It makes sense. Somebody's using the app. They say, okay, it was 6 days ago. Well, what happened? What did they do exactly? So let's paste this in here. And we're going to say, okay, we're the last interaction date, sure, and then the last interaction type in brackets afterwards. Okay, so how would we write this from a scope perspective? Let's go paste in this new scope, and it looks exactly like our previous scope. The only difference is it's on type and not created at. Everything else is identical. So the only other thing we need to do is we actually need to update our controller to call that new scope that we've created, right? All right, so we do this, we reload this page, and now we've got this customer query automatically loading the last interaction date and the last interaction type for us, and we're doing this very fast. We're still at 3 database queries, 3 megabytes of memory, and less than 40 milliseconds on the page load side. Excuse me. So that's great. But you might be thinking at this point, okay, well, what about if there's other stuff I wanted to do? Like, what if I wanted to make the last interaction, this is an actual link that when I clicked on it, I could go and see that interaction and learn more information about it. Could we do it differently? Could we do it more like a regular Eloquent relationship? And you can, and I'll show you how you can do this. So let's do this. Like, let's update the controller first. Okay, we're going to say customer with company with the last interaction, not the last interaction date or type. We're just going to say with the last interaction, then we'll order it just like we were before. Okay, so let's now update our customer model, and we're going to get rid of these two scopes here. They're just going to be gone. And we're going to create a standard has one relationship to get the last interaction, and the last interaction's going to look at, it's going to be for the interaction model, and it's going to look for the last interaction ID. Now, obviously, that doesn't exist on our customer table, but we can add it using a subselect. So I'm going to add a subselect just like we were before using my new macro syntax. And we're going to say last interaction ID, and we're going to say, give me the ID. So this is exactly like before. We're getting the created at and type. We're just going to grab the ID instead. And then we're going to, once we have the ID, we're going to eager load the last interaction, just like we've been eager loading the company the whole time. So let's try this out and make sure I have everything. Oh, I do need to update the blade view as well because it's not going to be as a column anymore. It's going to be as an actual model. So we're going to have customer last interaction and customer last interaction and created at and type, right? So if we reload this now, you're going to see we're going to have one more database query, but this should all work. So we've gone up one database query. So why did we go up a database query? The reason why is because now we're only selecting the ID, the last interaction ID in our original customer query. And what we're also doing then is we're eager loading using this new relationship we created. Just like the companies, we're eager loading all of those interactions, but it's only the 15 that we want to show on this page, not a whole, not all 7,500 of them, right? So that's why we have one extra database query. So whether or not, like I say, that's definitely a win. It's even though it's one more database query, it's still very, very fast. You can see here that we're still at 3 megs of memory, and we're at about 47, well within, less than 100 milliseconds, even closer to 50 milliseconds page load to get all this data. So this is really cool because now you're actually working with just an actual Eloquent model. So if you wanted to do something else, like maybe your interaction someday has some other sort of functionality, maybe there's another relationship on that interaction, or maybe you have some helper methods on it, or a getter or a getter of some sort, or whatever it is, you now have access to that, even though really the last interaction is not like a true relationship on the customer model. So really, really powerful stuff. Really great way to make a page like this load really, really fast. Even if you have, like in our situation, 1,000 records, if you had 10,000 records, this approach would work really, really, really well. Okay, what next? Oh yeah, so now that we've moved this to an actual relationship, up here, we can get rid of this last interaction date cast because we're no longer using that on the actual customer model. So we can just reload and that all works. And that works because the created at is an actual predefined Eloquent date that's converted to Carbon for us automatically. Okay, so let's look at our next requirement. We're just cranking right through this. Requirement number 5, let's make all the columns sortable. All right, so that seems pretty straightforward. Seems like a pretty normal, understandable request, right? So we've already got the name sorting, but what about the company and the birthday and the last interaction? These 3 are actually more difficult than, significantly more difficult than sorting the name because there's data in other tables. The birthday we want to sort specially. We don't want to sort by birth date. We want to sort by the actual birthday of the year, like January 1st to December 31st. So how would we go about doing this? All right, let me show you. So I'm going to start by pasting in some headers here, which just basically puts the routes in and sets the active one. Nothing too interesting there. If you want to look at it, feel free. It's in the repo. So, and now these are clickable, right? But we haven't done anything other than do that. So the only one that's actually working here is the name, and that's because that's done by default. Okay, so let's add some more code. Let's go back to our controller and let's change this order by name scope to order by field. So I'll do this more often when I have some sort of thing that I need to do, and there's going to be a bunch of different ways to do it. I'll create this intermediary scope that you can pass some information to, and it'll know how it'll go off and take care of the kind of the hard work for us, so that we can keep our controller nice and clean. So we're just going to give it the name, the order column. So we're going to pass it through as a request, and we're going to pass through name as a default. So if you don't give it any value, it's going to use name and it's going to sort by that. Okay, so what does this actual scope look like? Okay, jumping down here. So order by field, we pass it through the field, and we have 4 options here. We have name, company, birthday, and last interaction, and each one of those has a scope that it's going to call to do that sort, right? So we already have the one implemented, order by name. So if we hit save here, we hit reload, we should be good to go. So let's try company now. We haven't implemented that scope yet, so obviously we're going to get an error. Okay, so let's look at what that's going to take to implement. So here's one option. We can basically do a sort like this. So we know that the company is a one-to-one relationship to the customer, right? So we can just join in the companies, and then we can do an order by companies.name, and that will absolutely work. We run that, still fast. It's just in the main query, we're just doing an inner join on companies, and then we're doing a sort by that data. And that is a totally valid way of doing this, right? So you can see A here, jump to page 7 or 67, Z. Okay, that's all working great. Here's another way that you might want to do it. It's 6 of one, half a dozen the next maybe, but I kind of like this approach. I actually prefer to use a subquery in these situations instead of doing the join. So instead of doing it the join way, we'll do order by sub, and we'll pass it in an Eloquent query builder that says, well, just give me the name for this user or for this company for this customer. Okay, so order by sub actually doesn't exist. So this is another macro I've created. So I'm going to show you this macro. I'm going to open up the app service provider here again. And I'm going to grab, I actually have 2 macros that I use for sorting. And I have 2 because one's for just sorting ascending and one's for sorting descending. This is sort of like a pattern that Laravel follows as well. The default's ascending, and then you can choose, the default's ascending, and you can choose descending if you need it. So that's all that the second one here is. It just calls this one with descending. Anyway, so Laravel has this idea of order by raw, and you can use this to do a raw order. And so what I'm doing is I'm actually passing through the query that we're writing in our customer model here for this scope. And I'm passing through that query, and I'm doing a limit of 1 on it because it's a subquery. So just like the add sub select here works, it's exactly the same. And then I'm converting it to just raw SQL, and I'm pasting it in here. So your alarm bells might be going off here a little bit, like, oh, you can't do order by raw there, because like you could run into like SQL injection issues, and that's a good, if your alarm bells are going off right now, that's a good thing. That's shows that you know what to pay attention for when you're writing custom SQL. However, in our situation, this is perfectly safe because we're just using plain old, we're not injecting any data or generating these queries from customer data or anything like that. Now, if you were, you would have to take that into consideration, and you'd want to use bindings, which the order by raw actually does support. You can pass through bindings, so you just have to update this macro to take the bindings and then pass it through to the order by raw. I never need that because I never really use bindings in my orders, but I just thought I would mention that because if that is something you run into, you would have to implement it that way. Okay, enough about these macros. So that's how you can now build the order by sub scope using just a regular Eloquent query builder. So let's go ahead and rerun this, and sure enough, all works. It's working exactly like before, which is great. Okay, moving along here. Now let's talk about birthday. So this is taking a bit of a different. This is a little different than the stuff that we've been working on so far, because all the stuff we've been working through so far has been like relationship stuff, right? But this one's a little bit of a different problem. As I mentioned, we don't want to sort by when someone was born, because everyone's born in a different year, and we don't want to see the oldest person to the youngest person, or vice versa. We really want to see the person born when we're sorting the birthday column. We want to see the person with a birthday in January first, and then the person born in December 31st last. That's how this particular sort feature is going to work. So this is how you can implement this. So I'm just going to show you first that it works. So if I click here, January 1st, sure, and last page here, December 31st. So that's how it's supposed to be working. If we jump somewhere in the middle, we can see it's, I guess my random data is, yeah, I guess maybe you can see that it's working here. Okay. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to use some custom SQL. So this is not to sort this way is not like a built-in Laravel feature, but Laravel absolutely provides a way that you can do this sort of thing, and that's using order by raw. And all I'm doing is, like I said, I'm using Postgres. And if you were using MySQL, it would have a similar sort of function to do this. And I'm converting that birth date to this format. So my birthday is June 2nd, 1983. So what we're looking for that to convert to is 06 for June, and then 02 for the day of the month, right? So 06, 02. And if we convert every single date that way, and then we sort by it, well, it'll sort exactly how we want, which is exactly what's happening. So I think this is kind of a neat example of how you might have to do some raw SQL in your application to accomplish something in the database layer. And I sometimes think that we're scared of doing this kind of stuff. We're like, oh man, now we have like Postgres specific logic in our app, and that's just going to be terrible because if we ever want to like hot swap to MySQL, it's never going to work. It's like, here's the reality. It's not going to work either way. If you have an app, you're going to want to be able to take advantage of your database's functionality, the functionality that's not shared across every single database platform. And if you're not, you're really not taking full advantage of the database that you're using. So I'd say generally, you're going to want to be able to do things like this so that you can offer this sort of like to take advantage of this crazy extra power that your database has that maybe your ORM doesn't completely support out of the box. And we've done this a lot in our app. Like we do a lot of like geo stuff, and we use the PostGIS extension for Postgres, which allows us to do all sorts of crazy longitude, latitude, searching and sorting and everything else. And we do that all literally using Eloquent, but just using raw queries like this. So something to keep in mind. Okay, let's move on to the last one here. We're going to add the last interaction date. So we don't have that yet. So let's add that scope and paste it in here. All right, order by last interaction date, and we're going to use that existing function that we wrote, except we're going to use the descending version of it. So order by sub query descending, and then we're going to say get the created at from the interactions table for that customer and grab the latest one. And that works perfect. We have 22 hours ago, somebody paid an invoice, and let's go to the last one. One month ago, somebody also paid an invoice, and in between, 2 weeks ago, you can see that's sorting properly. And we're doing this, and so you can kind of see how this is working. It's ordering by a sub-select. It's ordering by this created at from interactions. So really, really powerful stuff. Allows you to do this sorting on this related data using these subqueries. And it's really fast because we're still at 4 database queries. We're still at only 3 megabytes of memory usage. And if we keep reloading here, we're about 65, 64 milliseconds for the page load. So really, really cool stuff, really powerful stuff. Okay, so we talked a lot about getting data and sorting data. How about like selecting data? Do some filtering. So let's add some filtering. So I'm going to update this view, and I'm going to add a form basically to just do some basic searching. This is just like a standard Bootstrap style form. Okay, so I paste that in. Nothing too remarkable there. So let me update the controller here as well. So this controller. We'll add now, so the only thing I added here was this new where search field that takes a search parameter from the actual request. And then we're going to create a new scope for this. So paste that in. So let's talk about this scope here for a second. So I don't want to spend too much time on this specific implementation. I'm more just I'm showing it just sort of as an example of how you could do this sort of thing. I'm doing basic just string comparison here, but if your database supports, which Postgres does, say full text search, you could implement that sort of functionality here. So I'm just doing basic string comparison here. So what I want to do is I want to take every single parameter that I type in here. So say I type in Funk or Ross Funk here, right? So we have that user here. I want it to search the first name, the last name, and the company name. So what I do is I explode that by the space. I basically take each individual term and I create a database query for each one of those, and I check the first name, the last name, and the company. So you can see how I'm using this really cool or where has functionality that's built into Eloquent, where I can actually do basically an aware on a relationship, and then I can, which is going to behind the scenes do a join. And then I'm going to check the name to see if it's like my term. So I'm using I-like because in Postgres, all string comparisons is case sensitive by default. So by using I-like, I can get around that. Just something to be aware of if you're using Postgres. So if we go ahead and run this, sure enough, it works. If we actually look at the database query that's generated here, you can see here that we're doing, okay, see if I can do this without getting lost in this. So you can see where the customer, so where the first name is I like funk, where the first name is the company name. So you can see all these, I've built up a bunch of wheres for all these 2 different terms across those 3 different tables or 3 different columns. So it's a simple little search scope, but it's actually quite powerful. Anyway, so we can see that our database queries are still at 4, memories and our page load, everything's good still. So let's try some other searches. I'm going to type in LLC because I know I have a bunch of companies in here with LLC. That works, all working great, and I can sort by this, and my sorting will be maintained. Pretty good, right? Like pretty simple. Took really very little effort to get this search implemented, and it's all working in the database layer and really fast. Okay, moving on. What's the next feature? Well, now we've got a requirement that they say, well, we want to add a filter to find all the customers whose birthday is this particular week. So again, doing work with the particular, like a birthday is actually it's tricky, right? So how would we go about implementing this? So birthdays this week. Well, we can't just do a simple date between comparison because that wouldn't work because we're looking for people with birthdays this year, but like a date between, like, somebody could have born, the years are all different, so how would we actually do that? And the answer is actually there's a pretty creative solution to this. So let me show you how you could do this. So I'm going to update the controller code. I'm going to get rid of this where search now, and I'm going to do where filter. So I'm going to kind of a bit of a refactor here. So previously I only had search, but now I want to do where filters because I have more than one filter happening here. So it's sort of like my order by field here. I want to have the ability to have multiple filters and then have that filter scope worry about like figuring out how to actually implement that and getting that out of my controller code. So let's go and implement this scope for where filters. So it takes an array of filters, which I convert to a collection just to make it easier to work with. And then I do query when there's a search. Well, then we're going to run where search. And when there's a filter that has birthday this week, well, then we're going to run our where birthday this week filter. So if we actually run this right now, it's going to fail because we haven't added the birthday this week filter or scope. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's grab the code to do this. I'm going to paste this in. I'm going to have to move this import to the top. 2 seconds. Okay, so let's look at the implementation of this for a sec. What we're going to do here is to find all the customers with a birthday this week. I'm going to use Carbon, which is, we've been talking about and using Carbon a little bit already. I'm going to use it to find the start of the week and the end of the week, and I'm going to save that as a start and end variable. Then I'm going to use PHP's interval functionality to basically build up an array of dates that follow the same format that we were looking at before, that month, day format, right? So what I'll end up with is when this is done, I'll end up with an array of dates for the current week that we can then pass to the database. So we're going to say where not in all the birth date, where in, and we're going to in the database convert the birth date to that format as well, and then do a where in on those dates that we've just prepared. So if we go here and actually run this, lo and behold, it runs. And if I sort it by birthdays this week, I'm going to get rid of the search here. If I sort it by birthdays this week, this new function. So we can see February 1st, birthdays this week. So today's the 7th, so that was 2 days ago. So that was Monday. So I remember thinking, well, Monday is not the beginning of the week. Sunday is, well, by default, PHP uses Monday as the start of the week. You can tell Carbon to use Sunday as the start of the week, but I haven't done that. It just wasn't worth the effort for this particular demo. But that's why we're getting Monday as the first day of the week. And if we go to the page 2 here, we can see the 11th being the end of the week. So really, I think this is a really neat example of how you can use PHP and the database together to do some really cool stuff to find data in your database. Like we're not making the database worry about figuring out what the current week is and preparing that. We're using PHP because it's really easy to do this in the database layers, in PHP. So we're not going to make the database do that. Now, in reality, you probably could generate this series of dates in Postgres, but that's way above my pay grade with Postgres. So to me, this is like a really nice way of going about it. And it's really fast, right? Because we do this once, we have this data prepared, and we now pass it down to the database, which just says it doesn't care what those dates are. It just knows it's got to do basically a string comparison to find all the people with that date. So you might be thinking with like when I'm doing this sort of stuff here, like this, date to string conversion. I did it here and also in the sorting. You might be thinking, well, how performant is that? And yeah, like doing those type of tasks in the database, that is definitely a slower task, but you can definitely see from our results here that it's had basically no bearing on our overall speed. Memory still load, and the actual time to do the page, we're still well below 100 milliseconds. And if you did find that to be an issue, you can actually create indexes in Postgres on a function like that so that you can actually look up against that and to get, if you found that was, say, a point of a slowness in your database. Okay, so that's pretty neat, right? So we got some really good filtering options now. Everything's working good. Everything's fast. And now they come and say, we're given the requirement, says, okay, we only want to show the customers that the current user is allowed to view. And this is actually a very common problem. So in a normal Laravel app, you might be using Laravel's policies, which are amazing. And you can use the policies, and that gives you your current user, and it gives you some sort of object, be it a customer or something else. And you can say, okay, you can do some logic within that policy to say, well, can this user see this customer? Or can this user edit this customer? Or can this user delete this customer? And those policies are useful because you can use them in your blade views, and you can use them in your routing layer and different things like that. But the problem is you can't use those policies on a page like this where you're doing a database query. Really what we need to do here is we need to re-implement that policy in our database query. And this is like really powerful and really useful to do. And I do this more often. And it's not, you don't need to do this for all your policies. It's generally only for your policies that you need to run on when you're doing a search for a bunch of data. All right. So let me show you how you can go about implementing this. I'm going to show you the scope first. So this is more often what these scopes look like. It's sort of an inverse of the how you'd write it as a policy. So normally as a policy, you might say can see or can view that customer. Now we're going to do customer visible to some user. So when you pass a user to that scope, we can say in this situation, okay, I should also show you one more thing in the database here. So if we go back to our users table here, I said we had 3 users, me, Taylor, and Ian, right? So me and Taylor are just regular users. We're not admins, but Ian is set as an admin because he's the boss, right? So what we want to do here is if the user that's logged in is the admin, we want to basically just return the query as is. We don't want to do any filtering on that at all because the admin can see everything. However, if it's not an admin, well, then we want to scope the customers to the sales rep ID, which relates to one of the user IDs. So let's look at what that would look like in the actual controller. So I'm going to update this here. So now I don't actually have an auth system in place, so I'm just going to sort of fake it for the purpose of this talk, but you would do something like this, visible to auth user. That's kind of how you would use it in a real world situation. But I'm just going to load some data manually here. So I'm going to say visible to Jonathan. So let's reload this here. And sure enough, I'm going to clear all my searches. We now have 489 customers for me. And if we look at the actual queries here, we have one more query. That's only because I'm loading this user record. Don't be alarmed. So if we look in here, we can see here that the customer now has a where sales rep ID equals 1. So that's finding the customers that are visible to me. So we can do the same thing for Taylor here. We load that, 511. Looks like he's got a few more customers. Obviously, Taylor's a slightly better salesperson than I am. And then if we do Ian, he's the boss. He gets all 1,000 user records. So really a simple but powerful pattern to push some of your policy logic into your database layer for when you need to do that so that you don't have to say do in your blade view a check for every single user. Well, can this user see this or edit this person and then put that in there? You can push that work to the database layer and keep things really fast. So we've done all this work now, and we still have a page with all this new functionality that's more or less loading in the same amount of time and using the same amount of memory. So really cool, really powerful stuff. All right, so let me just maybe end with just one slide here where I talk about scopes in general. So you see that I use scopes very aggressively here, and this is pretty normal for my projects. I'll do that more often. And the reason why I love scopes over, say, just doing a bunch of raw database stuff and say my controller, working with all this code in my controller or maybe a service class or something else. The reason why I like it is because the scopes is like, this is like built-in Laravel functionality. The scopes are here for this very purpose. So they basically allow you to encapsulate this database code in these reusable functions, which is really nice. You can use it. You might think, well, I don't need this in another place in my app, but you don't necessarily know that. More often than not, you'll write a scope in one place and you'll end up using it in another place or numerous other places in your app. And you may not use it in this exact configuration. You might just need the visible to, or you might just need a filter or sorting or whatever it is. But now you can like handpick each one of those scopes and use them sort of at your leisure where needed. The other thing I love about scopes is they give you names to your commonly used queries. So in this situation, we're not like putting a whole bunch right in here, a bunch of this crazy sub-select stuff. We're just saying, give me the last interaction. That's all I'm looking for. It's really easy to read when I look at this controller code. And same with the where the filters and the order by the field and the visible to. These are all very readable methods, which I think is a huge win from a readability perspective. The other thing nice about scopes is that they're chainable, which is something we've been doing the whole time here. You can do one scope and then you can add another one on and add another one on and kind of just build them up as needed using this this chaining that the Laravel scopes provide. And finally, I think, and this is really a neat one, which we didn't really look at here today, but scopes can be applied to both models and relationships. So we've been applying all these scopes to a model. But if you were to do some eager loading where you actually pass through a function here to like scope this particular function that loads the companies, maybe we wanted to scope that down somehow, we could actually use a scope right in here and say, maybe where search, and we only show who knows what we do. We could apply really any scope that we want in the exact same way to a relationship. And that's really useful in more areas. So that's another nice thing about scope to keep in mind. Now, obviously, this scope here would be on the actual company model, not on the customer model. Okay, so that's all I have. If you are interested in hearing me talk more about database stuff, because it's kind of an area of interest of mine, you can follow me on Twitter. My username is Reinink, R-E-I-N-I-N-K. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about my talk there, or obviously on the chat. I'll do my best to answer those questions today. And I would just maybe end with one more just quick pump for Spur. This is a really cool company down in Huntsville, Alabama. And the team has grown a lot, and we have a lot of big goals for this year and next year. And we're looking for really good people. So if you happen to live in the greater Huntsville area and are looking for a role as, say, a Laravel developer or a front-end developer, we'd love to hear from you. This is our careers page, spurjobs.com/careers. Check it out. And yeah, that's all I have. Thanks for listening.
All right. That was awesome. You really dug that. I got my database background up now.
What room are you in now?
This is war games. You're in the war games?
I'm the worst.
And
I shouldn't have admitted that amongst.
That's right.
It's incriminating myself here.
You're gonna have to go into internet hiding now.
Back up.
Revoke the card here. That's awesome. A lot of people really like that. I think that digs into that stuff that Eloquent makes so easy to just like bypass all that, and then when you do start to get a little bigger, you gotta kind of get down in there, which is true of all database apps. Like it's all fine day one, and get some data in there, and it's not.
Yes, that's exactly it. And I'd like to actually thank Chris again for explaining some of the N+1 stuff in his talk, because that actually set the stage for me, because I didn't really get into explaining exactly what the N+1 issue was, but he did that very well. So shout out to him for that.
Here. We know what we're doing.
Well, yeah, it's almost like we coordinated this, right?
Coordinated. So there's a lot of questions for you on the chat, but most of them I feel like are not going to be, like us communicating them here is not going to be very effective. Yeah. But there's one I think that we could discuss, which what are your thoughts about going even deeper down into the database and using like stored procedures for some of these things?
I know. I have always sort of wondered, like, are stored procedures sort of like this magical thing that I've got to explore? I've avoided them basically for one main reason. And I think it's because I just hate this idea that there's this code that's floating out there somewhere in the database that's not like in my Git repo. Now, I understand it could still be managed in your version control and stuff like that. I guess I'd say that maybe I just feel more comfortable keeping that code in PHP because it's what I know and I'm very familiar with. But I think that there is absolutely companies, like depending on your needs, that is absolutely a logical way to go to create stored procedures. Again, it's going to depend on your particular app, but I could see definite use cases where that's a good tool to use.
All right, cool. Well, great job. We're going to let you go and take a break here. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. See you guys.